Bruce Lee challenged Chuck Norris backstage. What happened after was never filmed. Culver City, California, October 17th, 1971. A Sunday afternoon, 2:38 p.m. The soundstage had been dark since Friday. The production, a low-budget martial arts picture that would eventually find its audience in drive-ins and second-run theaters from Bakersfield to Jacksonville, remembered by almost no one who made it, and warmly by a narrow subset of people who saw it, had wrapped its principal, photography ahead of schedule, which was a minor miracle that the producers attributed to efficiency and the director attributed to luck. And the two men who had been brought in to choreograph and perform the film's fight sequences attributed to the fact that when you have people who actually know what they're doing, things go faster. The stage was on the back lot of a small independent production company in Culver City, 3 blocks from the MGM facilities. It smelled of sawdust and acetone and the particular dry air smell of spaces that have been heated by large lights and then gone cold. There were canvas-backed chairs folded against the far wall. There were 2 false walls, part of the set that had been broken down but not entirely struck, leaning at angles against each other, held up by laziness and gravity in roughly equal measure. There was a craft services table with a half-empty coffee urn and a box of donuts that had been there since Thursday and whose relationship to freshness had long since been renegotiated. 2 men had come back to the stage that Sunday afternoon. They had not been asked to come. The production was done. They had no obligation there. They had come because the stage had a floor, 40 feet by 60 feet of hardwood, reasonably smooth, adequately sprung, and because the stage was empty and they had an unfinished conversation that could only be continued on a floor. Bruce Lee was 30 years old. He was 5 feet, 7 inches tall and 131 pounds, and the 131 pounds were arranged with a precision that suggested not nutrition science or weight training, but something more fundamental. A long process of refinement, of reduction, of the elimination of everything that was not exactly what it needed to be. He had been training since childhood, had studied Wing Chun under the legendary Ip Man in Hong Kong, had developed and refined and discarded and rebuilt his approach to martial arts for 20 years, and was in the process, on this particular October afternoon in 1971, of continuing to develop what he had begun calling Jeet Kune Do, which was not a style but a philosophy of no style, an approach that held that any fixed system contained the seeds of its own limitation, and that the only real art was the art of responding to what is actually there, rather than to what your system has told you to expect. He was also, at this point in his life, navigating the particular difficulty of being enormously talented in a field that the American entertainment industry had not yet found a way to frame. His Hong Kong films had done extraordinary business in Asia. His American career was a smaller room still being entered. The Green Hornet had established a fan base. The feature films were coming, but hadn't arrived yet. He was teaching, privately, and developing his ideas about the martial arts with the focused urgency of a man who can feel the shape of something but hasn't yet fully articulated it. Chuck Norris was 31 years old. He was 5 feet 10 inches tall, 168 pounds, and the 3-time consecutive holder, at that point, of the Professional Karate Association World Middleweight Championship, a title he had first won in 1968 and would continue to hold through 1974. He had come to California from Oklahoma and Korea and the Air Force Base Circuit and the small karate schools he had been running since 1962. And he had come in particular to the attention of Bruce Lee through the tournament circuit that Lee attended not to compete, but to study, to watch other people's bodies doing things, filing away what he saw with the same systematic attention he brought to everything. They had met 18 months earlier at a tournament in Long Beach. The meeting had been brief and technical, 2 men in the vicinity of each other's work, recognizing something in the quality of the recognition itself. Lee had introduced himself. Norris had known who he was. They had talked for perhaps 20 minutes at the edge of the tournament floor, and the conversation had the quality of 2 streams of water that have been running in parallel and then find themselves in the same channel, not merging exactly, but aligning, discovering a common direction. They had trained together perhaps a dozen times since then, not formally, not with the structure of a student-teacher relationship, but in the mode of genuine peers exchanging what they knew, which is the highest form of martial arts transmission and the rarest, because it requires both people to be willing to be wrong, to be corrected, to receive. Chuck had weapons that Bruce was interested in. The precision of his kicks, honed over years of Tang Soo Do and competition, had an economy and a stopping power that Bruce found compelling and wanted to understand from the inside. Bruce had things that Chuck was interested in, the philosophical framework he was building, the conceptual rigor he applied to the question of what the martial arts actually were beneath their cultural wrapping. Their friendship had developed in the way that the best friendships between men develop, through work, through accumulated hours of shared, honest effort, through the gradual mutual discovery that the other person's company made the work better. They ate together sometimes, or they talked about films, about ambition, about the specific frustrations of being the kind of person they were in the specific cultural moment they were in. They argued about ideas with the genuine engagement of people who are not managing each other's feelings, but are actually trying to get at something. There was a specific evening, 3 months before the Culver City session, when Bruce and Chuck had been in the backyard of a house in Bel Air belonging to a mutual acquaintance who was hosting a small gathering of people from the film world and the martial arts world, the two communities having more overlap in Los Angeles in 1971 than they did almost anywhere else. They had ended up at the edge of the gathering, near a low wall, with drinks. They weren't really drinking, talking about something that had come up earlier in the conversation, whether the martial arts, as they were being adapted for American audiences, were losing something essential. Bruce had said, "What's being lost is the cost. In the original transmission, every practitioner paid a real price. Years of work before you were permitted to approach the higher levels. Pain, failure, genuine risk. The art contained all of that. The American version wants the skill without the cost." Chuck had said, "Some of it is being lost, some of it is being translated. Different cost structures for different contexts." Bruce had looked at him. "Translation or dilution?" he said. "Is there a difference?" Chuck had thought about this honestly, the way he thought about most things. Not quickly, not with the instinct to agree or disagree, but with an actual effort to find the accurate answer. "There's a difference in intention," he said. "Translation respects the original and tries to find the equivalent in the new context. Dilution just removes the difficulty." He paused. "Whether the translation succeeds, that's another question." "And your schools?" Bruce said. "Both, at different times," Chuck said. "I've translated some things well. I've probably diluted others without knowing it. That's the honest answer." Bruce had nodded with the specific quality he had when he received something that confirmed a belief. Not smug confirmation, but the settling quality of a thing coming into alignment with other things. "The honest answer is always the interesting one," he said. This was the texture of their friendship. Honest, specific, mutually demanding without being competitive, conducted at the level of ideas as well as the level of technique. They challenged each other's thinking, the way serious people who respect each other challenge thinking, not to win, not to demonstrate superiority, but because the only way to know if something is true is to subject it to contact with someone capable of honestly contesting it. They argued about forms, about whether codified forms were, as Bruce was increasingly arguing, a ceiling on development, or whether, as Chuck maintained, they were a necessary foundation. This argument would never be fully resolved between them, not because neither was right, but because they were approaching the same territory from different directions. And the territory was large enough that both approaches were finding real things in it. They would not arrive at the same conclusions. They would both be right about different parts of the same truth. They argued about the role of competition. Bruce was skeptical of tournament formats, the rules, the controlled environments, the reduction of martial arts to a point-scoring exercise that rewarded certain techniques and penalized others. Chuck, who had built his professional identity within tournament competition, had more nuanced views. The tournament was limited, yes, but it was also a kind of honest test that most practitioners never had access to. And there was something that the regular experience of being tested in front of other people, of having your skills assessed in real time against a real opponent who was genuinely trying to defeat you, did for a practitioner's development that no amount of private training could replicate. "The tournament produces one kind of fighter," Bruce said. "What kind?" Chuck said. "A fighter calibrated to tournament conditions, who may or may not have the deeper thing." "Some have it," Chuck said. "The ones who trained honestly. The tournament didn't give it to them, but it didn't take it away either." "And the ones who don't have it?" "They beat you on points," Chuck said. "And then they go home, and they're the same person they were before." Bruce had smiled at that. A real smile, not the performance smile he sometimes deployed in social settings. The smile of someone who has heard something that pleased them at a level below courtesy. Their friendship had continued on the floor and away from it, and the floor had developed between them a specific grammar, a way of exchanging that was collaborative without being soft, that used contact as communication rather than as contest. Chuck arrived at the Culver City soundstage having worked within that grammar a dozen times, knowing its particular character, prepared for what it usually was. He was not prepared for what Bruce wanted it to be today, which was different, more real, more committed. The grammar pushed into something closer to its own limits. The challenge that brought them back to the empty soundstage on that Sunday afternoon in October 1971 had been issued 4 days earlier, on the Thursday of the last day of production. In the brief, formless time after the director called final cut and before the production machinery of packing up and settling accounts began to engage. It had been issued by Bruce Lee. This requires some context. The challenge had not been a public thing. It had not been theatrical. It had been a quiet sentence said in the corridor outside the soundstage as the crew was moving around them, said in that particular tone that Bruce sometimes used, direct, almost abrupt, stripped of social padding. When he had arrived at a question he wanted the honest answer to. "I want to spar you," Bruce had said. Real, not for the camera, not for anyone. Chuck had looked at him. "We've sparred," he said. "We've worked together," Bruce said. "That's different." Chuck understood the distinction. They had exchanged. Probed, explored, demonstrated, collaborated. That was the word Bruce used, work together. What Bruce was proposing was different, a genuine full engagement exchange, where both of them were actually trying, where the outcome was not staged and not pre-negotiated, where whatever happened was what was actually true between them. "Why?" Chuck had said. Bruce had been quiet for a moment. Around them, crew members were carrying equipment through the corridor, having conversations about logistics and wrap parties and what time they needed to be somewhere. The ordinary world going about its business, while two men had a conversation that the ordinary world would have found difficult to accurately interpret. "I've been building something," Bruce had said. "Jeet Kune Do. I've tested it against a lot of people. Good people." He paused. "But I need to test it against someone at your level. Someone who actually has everything. The title, the time, the real competition. I need to know if what I'm building holds up." "And if it doesn't?" Chuck had said. Bruce had looked at him with an expression that contained, in equal measure, the confidence of a man who has tested his ideas extensively, and the intellectual honesty of a man who understands that extensive testing is not the same as complete testing. "Then I need to know that," Bruce had said. Chuck had looked at him. He had thought about it. Not for long, because the answer was not complicated. "Sunday," he had said. "After 2, the stage will be empty." And so they were there. They were alone in the way that the best exchanges require aloneness, not the loneliness of isolation, but the aloneness of two people who have temporarily suspended their relation to the rest of the world in order to be completely in relation to each other. There was no audience, there were no cameras, there was nothing to perform for and nothing to prove to anyone other than themselves, and even proving to themselves was not precisely the right word for what they were doing. They were inquiring. They were asking the floor a question and waiting for the floor to answer. Chuck had arrived first. He had driven over from his house, changed in the car, and let himself into the stage through the side door that the production manager had told him would be unlocked. He had walked the floor, literally had walked it, feeling the give and the grain of the hardwood getting his body in relation to the space. He had done some preliminary forms in the back corner alone, the slow, deliberate, meditative movement that is the beginning of getting ready without broadcasting that you are getting ready. He did not think about Bruce particularly. He thought about his own body, about the quality of his balance that day, about the particular state of his right knee, which had been slightly inflamed since a hard session 2 weeks earlier, and which he was managing carefully. Bruce arrived at 2:38. He came through the side door, saw Chuck in the back corner, stopped and looked for a moment at what he was doing, the slow forms, the patient presence, with the expression of a man who was gathering information without any particular agenda attached to it, pure observation, the thing that made Bruce Lee genuinely unusual. His eyes worked like instruments rather than organs of confirmation. He changed. He came to the floor. They acknowledged each other without ceremony. For the first few minutes, they moved around each other in the way that serious practitioners move at the opening of a real exchange, not yet engaging, not circling with aggression, but locating each other, establishing the geography of the distance between them, reading the way the other person inhabited the space. It is a language of its own, this preliminary movement, and it carries real information. How a person breathes, how their weight shifts, where they look, and how long they hold the look, what their neutrality looks like, and therefore what departure from neutrality will look like. Chuck was heavier on his feet than Bruce in a useful way. The weight was earned, was muscle memory, was the grounding of a man who had spent 12 years in Tang Soo Do, learning to transfer power from the floor up through the body and out through the striking surface. Bruce was faster in a way that wasn't about speed exactly. It was about the minimization of preparation, the reduction of the telegraph that precedes most strikes to something approaching 0, so that the strike and the intention to strike were nearly simultaneous, and the opponent, therefore, had almost no time between reading the intention and responding to the execution. They had a half hour of sustained, serious exchange. To describe it as sparring is technically accurate and experientially inadequate. Sparring suggests a framework of practice, of partial engagement, of the preserved distance between demonstration and actual intent. What happened on that floor in Culver City on that October afternoon was something closer to a conversation conducted in the only language that does not permit exaggeration, evasion, or polite interpretation, the language of two bodies trying to find the truth of each other. Bruce came with combinations that no classical style had codified, not because they violated the principles of classical martial arts, but because they were assembled from multiple traditions and adapted to the specific situation in the specific second, with a flexibility that formal styles by their nature could not easily match. He was genuinely difficult to track. The simplification of preparation that he had worked toward in Jeet Kune Do, the reduction of the gap between decision and execution, made his offense arrive from a closer distance and with less warning than most opponents could generate. Chuck's defense was fundamentally different from anything Bruce encountered with most opponents, because it was the defense of someone who had spent years in actual competition at the highest level, where the people hitting you were also the best in the country at their specific approach, and where what had been learned from being hit was therefore of the highest quality. He had been educated by Joe Louis and Bob Wall and the entire constellation of serious American karate in the 1960s, and the education had produced something that was less a technique of defense than a calibration. The capacity to be in the right place and the right relation to a strike before the strike had fully committed, which made deflection and evasion available as options where blocking and absorbing would have been necessary for a less precisely calibrated defender. There were moments in that 30 minutes where something extraordinary happened, where the exchange between the two men reached a level of speed and precision and mutual adaptation that existed outside any style or system or language, where it was simply two of the finest martial artists of their generation discovering what was true when there was nothing to protect and nothing to prove. These moments did not last long. They couldn't, physiologically, but while they lasted, they had the quality of insight that exists in other domains, the quality of seeing clearly without effort, of understanding without translation, of being exactly where you are without remainder. There were also moments of failure. Chuck was caught twice by strikes he should have seen, combinations that Bruce's systematic elimination of telegraphing had rendered nearly invisible. He felt them. Neither landed at full power. Both were controlled to a level that precluded damage, but he felt them as information. Here is what I did not account for. Here is what requires revision. Bruce was taken down once to the floor from a grappling entry that Chuck transitioned to when a kick exchange closed their distance in a way that made the ground the right available option. The takedown was clean, judo-influenced, crisp, the kind of technique that Chuck's training with Bob Wall had refined over years. And Bruce landed on his back with the particular controlled quality of a man who has been thrown before and knows how to fall, which means the fall tells you less about the thrower than a bad fall would. He was off the floor before Chuck had completed his follow-through, and the expression on his face was not surprise exactly, but something alert and specific. The expression of someone who has just received a piece of information they had known was possible in theory and have now received as practice. They stopped. Not formally, not with a signal. They simply both came to a natural pause, a mutual recognition that the exchange had arrived somewhere, that the question they had come to ask had been substantially answered. They were both breathing hard. Chuck's knee was letting him know, without subtlety, that it had been used. Bruce's right forearm had a developing bruise from a block he had applied to a kick that arrived with more power than his positioning had fully accounted for. They stood in the middle of the empty soundstage. The afternoon light came through the high windows, angled and golden. The two false walls still leaned against each other, near the back. The craft services table still held its 3-day-old donuts. "The takedown," Bruce said. "You didn't account for it," Chuck said. "No." Bruce looked at his wrist, flexed it. "I was tracking for your kicks. When you switched to grappling..." He paused. He was reconstructing his own processing, running the exchange backward with the specific precision of a man who treats his own performance as data. "I had you categorized." "As a kicker," Chuck said. "As a kicker?" "Yes." Bruce looked at him. "That's the thing I'm trying to eliminate, the categorization. But even when you know the error, you still make it. Because the category is real," Chuck said. "I am a kicker, primarily. But not only." "No, not only." Bruce looked at the floor. He was doing what Chuck recognized as his particular version of thinking. Complete, absorbed, slightly absent from the room while being completely in it, the way a lens is absent from what it focuses. "The thing your system does," Bruce said. "The kick, specifically. The power is..." He stopped, recalibrated. "How do you transfer that much through a kick?" 13 years, Chuck said. Bruce looked at him. "I'm serious," Chuck said. "It's not a technique. It's the deposit of 13 years of repetition. By now, the movement pattern is so deep in the nervous system, it happens below conscious direction. When the kick lands, the whole body is behind it because the body has done it often enough to know how. The form work, Bruce said. The form work, Chuck confirmed. Before I could do it fast, I did it slow, thousands of times, slow enough to put it in the right place in the body. The speed came after. The power came from the integration. Bruce was quiet, absorbing this. He was not nodding in the superficial way. He was receiving it, testing it against his own framework, finding the places where it aligned and the places where it created tension with what he believed. The form, work, Bruce said slowly, is a limitation if it's done as a limitation. If the practitioner can only do what the form contains. Yes, Chuck said, absolutely. But done as, Bruce paused, searching, as a method of depositing pattern, of building the body's intelligence, not as a prescription, but as a grammar, Chuck said. Bruce looked at him. Before you can speak freely, Chuck said, you need the grammar in your body, so deep you don't think about it. Then you can say what you want. The grammar doesn't limit the speech. It makes the speech possible. Bruce was silent for a long moment. In that silence, Chuck could see him working, the specific quality of Bruce Lee's internal work, which had a visible texture to it, a density, like watching a person lift something genuinely heavy even when they are standing still. That's the tension I've been sitting with, Bruce said, between the liberation from forms, from fixed pattern, and the necessity of foundation. I've been arguing against forms, but he looked at Chuck. What you're saying is that the argument is against forms used as ceilings, not against forms used as floors. Yes, Chuck said. The form is where you build it, Bruce said, not where you stay. Right. Bruce looked at the floor. He looked at his hands. He looked at something that wasn't in the room. Do you know what frustrated me about most of the people I trained with before this? He said. They stayed in. The form. They built the floor and then lived on it. They confused the foundation for the finished structure. Some people need the floor, Chuck said. Not everyone has the ability or the time to build beyond it. The floor is better than dirt. Bruce looked at him with an expression that was complicated. Yes, he said slowly. I know that. Intellectually, I know that. He paused. But I am not interested in teaching people to live on the floor. I know, Chuck said. That's why your school looks like it does. And yours looks like it does, Bruce said. Different approach. Both real. Chuck nodded. This was the thing about their friendship that was hardest to articulate to someone outside it. The genuine mutual recognition, not the mutual admiration of two public figures who have been introduced and understand the social value of each other's approval. Something more specific. The recognition that two people have when they have both traveled far enough in a shared direction to understand what the other person's journey cost and what it produced. They had different styles, different philosophies, different public identities. They had the same thing underneath. Bruce sat down on the floor, cross-legged, in the abrupt way he sometimes sat down, not with the deliberation of someone choosing to rest, but with the directness of someone who has decided that being lower is appropriate. Chuck sat down too, on the floor, stretching his right leg out because the knee wanted extension. They sat in the sound stage for a while. The light moved. Outside, the Sunday afternoon in Culver City went on as Sunday afternoons do. Streets quiet, the particular stillness of a day that has stepped outside the work week's current. Bruce said, "You're better than I thought." Chuck looked at him. The competition record is accurate, Bruce said. But a competition record is a record of a person in a specific context. I didn't fully know what you were outside that context. What changed your assessment? Chuck said. The way you use distance, Bruce said. In competition, you use it aggressively. You control the range to set up your offense. Here, just now, you used it differently, patiently. You were content to wait. Most competition fighters can't wait. They've been trained to score, to initiate, to drive the action. You can be still. Being still is harder than moving, Chuck said. Yes, considerably harder. Bruce looked at him. Where did you learn it? Chuck was quiet for a moment. Korea, he said. 1958. The instructor on base, Master J. Chul-shin, he used to make us stand in a low stance for 20 minutes at the beginning of every class. Not moving, just in the stance. You had to stop fighting the stance and let the stance hold you. He paused. That's where I learned to be still, not metaphorically. Literally. My body learned it before my mind did. The body learns first, Bruce said. Usually. The mind takes credit, Bruce said. There was something dry in it, not bitter but precise. The The quality of a man who has observed this pattern often enough to note it without emotion. The mind takes credit, Chuck agreed. They sat for another while. The donuts on the craft services table sat in their box, 3 days old and patiently going stale. The two false walls leaned together near the back, their shadows long on the floor. Bruce said, "I want to do a film with you." Chuck looked at him. "Not this." Bruce gestured vaguely at the room around them, at the context of the low-budget production they had just concluded. "Something real. I want to write a fight sequence for us. Let me write what I know we both can do. Not what a fight looks like to someone who's never been in one." He paused. "A real fight sequence. The closest thing to truth that a film can hold." Chuck thought about this. He thought about what it would mean. The choreography of it. The geometry. Two martial artists of this specific character in a specifically designed exchange. Staged but honest. Fictional but real in its physics. "The Coliseum thing is too easy," Chuck said. "Big arena, dramatic stakes, the obvious setup. If we're going to do this, it should cost something." "Yes," Bruce said immediately. "Cost something. The character should lose. Not because the plot needs it, but because the loss means something. It should mean something." "The character loses," Chuck said. "Not dishonorably." "Never dishonorably," Bruce said. "With dignity, with the acknowledgement that what he faced was genuinely beyond what he had." He looked at Chuck. "That's the honest version. The man who fights and loses to someone better is not diminished. He's revealed." They talked about the film for a while. The conversation was not fully formed. It was the beginning of an idea, the first architecture of something that would take more time and more specificity to become what it eventually became. The film they were describing, in its loose first outline, would eventually be made as Way of the Dragon, shot in Rome and Hong Kong in 1972, and the fight sequence they were sketching, the Coliseum sequence, despite Chuck's ambivalence about the setting, would become what many martial artists consider the finest stage combat in the history of cinema. Not because of its dramatics, but precisely because of the quality Chuck had named. The quality of two people who actually knew what they were doing, and the quality Bruce had named, the quality of loss that means something. But before any of that, before Rome and Hong Kong and the Coliseum and the cameras, there was this Sunday afternoon in an empty sound stage in Culver City. Two men sitting on a hardwood floor talking about what it means for a thing to be real, what it means for a loss to carry dignity, what it means to have a floor beneath you that you built. Honestly, and that holds your weight. "The reason I came to you," Bruce said at some point in the conversation, "not the reason I gave you, the real one." Chuck waited. "I needed to know if what I was building could handle contact with the best," Bruce said. "Not just technically, philosophically. Jeet Kune Do is a framework built on a specific premise that the system that imprisons itself in fixed form is limited, that real martial arts requires the freedom to respond to what is, actually present." He paused. "If that premise is correct, it should survive contact with the best practitioner of a traditional system. If it doesn't survive, I need to revise the premise." "And?" Chuck said. "It survives," Bruce said, "with corrections." He touched the bruise developing on his forearm. "The corrections are real. The premise holds." Chuck looked at him. "You're not going to tell me if you think you won," Chuck said. Not accusing, genuinely curious. Bruce's expression now moved in that direction that might be a smile. "Neither of us won," he said. "Both of us found things." Chuck nodded. This was the truest assessment available, and the fact that it came from Bruce Lee rather than from either of them separately was itself meaningful. It was the assessment of someone who was genuinely not invested in a narrative of victory, who cared about the information more than the score. "What did you find?" Bruce asked. Chuck thought about it. He thought about the 2 strikes that had landed, the ones he hadn't seen, the ones that Bruce's reduction of the telegraph had rendered nearly invisible. He thought about what they represented in terms of his own defensive model, what gap they pointed to, what revision was indicated. "That my defense is calibrated for competition formats," he said, "for the way fights happen in the ring, within the rules, against people who are working from recognizable styles, against something that doesn't fit those patterns." He paused. "I need work." "Where?" "In the way I process information during an exchange," Chuck said. "I'm good at reading the immediate setup, the combination, the entry, the setup for the finish. What I'm less good at is reading the absence of setup, the thing that arrives without preparation." He looked at Bruce. "That's what you do. You eliminated the preparation, or reduced it to the point where my processing time isn't enough." "Yes," Bruce said. "That's the core of it. The moment of decision and the moment of action need to approach simultaneity. The opponent's processing time needs to be inside the total time available. If decision and execution are close enough together, the processing time required of the opponent is greater than the time available to him. How do you train that? Chuck said. The reduction. Slowly, Bruce said, paradoxically. He looked at Chuck, and there was something warm in it, the warmth of someone who has found in the person in front of them something worth being serious with. The same way you built the power. You don't begin with the speed. You begin with the form, deliberately, the removal of each unnecessary micromotion, slowly, until the form is clean. Then you add speed to the clean form, and the clean form holds up under the speed, and the speed does not reconstruct the micromotions. He paused. Form as floor, not as ceiling. Chuck smiled. It was the first time he had fully smiled in the exchange, not the partial, ambiguous movement that might be a smile but had not committed, but an actual smile. The smile of a man who has received something from another person and wants to acknowledge the receiving. You just used my framework, he said. It's a good framework, Bruce said, not apologetically, as a simple statement of truth. They got up. They moved around the floor for another 20 minutes. Not sparring, not exchanging, but working through individual technique, each of them taking the things the conversation had identified and beginning to work on them in their own bodies, while the other was present. Bruce worked on grappling defense, specifically the transition from striking distance to clinch range, the range that his system was least developed in and that Chuck's takedown had exposed. Chuck worked on the reduction of his defensive calibration, trying to access a mode of reading that was less pattern-based and more immediate, less expert at recognizing the familiar and more available to the genuinely unfamiliar. They worked like this, separately but together, each in their own investigation, but aware of the others, until the light in the high windows began to lose its afternoon quality and take on the early tinge of California evening, golden and slightly melancholy in the way that California evenings often are, as though the day is reluctant to end and is protesting by making itself beautiful. Bruce stopped first. He sat down again, briefly, and Chuck sat across from him. They were both tired in the specific way that genuine physical work produces. Not depleted, but settled, the body having been used honestly and returning a particular quality of rest as reward. Nobody can know about this, Bruce said. Chuck looked at him. I know, he said. Not because I'm... Bruce paused. It's not about protecting my reputation or yours. It's because this... He made a gesture that encompassed the floor and the afternoon and the exchange and the conversation. If it becomes a story people tell, it becomes different from what it was. People will ask who won. They will need a winner, and that will make this into something it wasn't. It wasn't a competition, Chuck said. No, Bruce said. It was an inquiry, and inquiries don't have winners, they have findings. He looked at the floor. The findings belong to us. Chuck nodded once. He meant it without reservation. The things. The floor had told them, the corrections and the revisions and the framework that had been confirmed and the framework that had been refined and the particular quality of understanding that arrives when two serious practitioners work at the actual boundary of their development. These belonged to the two people who had been present for them and to no one else. They left the soundstage separately. Bruce left first. He had a dinner, an obligation in Bel Air, the social machinery of a career in motion. Chuck stayed for a few minutes after he heard Bruce's car start and pull out of the lot. He sat in the empty stage and felt the quality of the afternoon, the specific shape of a day that had contained something irreplaceable. He thought about a form, not Tang Soo Do specifically, not the forms master Jae-Chul Shin had taught him on the base in Korea, not the ones he had built into his own Chun-Kuk-Do system. A form as a concept, a way of moving that had been deposited in his body so deeply that it was no longer movement but disposition, the body's educated tendency toward a certain way of being in the world. He thought about the forms that had been deposited that afternoon, the adjustments to his defensive model, the new information about where the calibration needed widening, the Bruce Lee finding, that the absence of preparation could be trained, that simultaneity of decision and execution was a reachable destination if approached with patience and honesty. He thought about what Bruce had said about being revealed. The character loses, not dishonorably, with dignity, with the acknowledgement that what he faced was genuinely beyond what he had. That's the honest version. The man who fights and loses to someone better is not diminished. He's revealed, he thought. I have been revealed today, not diminished. Revealed. The two strikes that landed, the defensive gap they pointed to, these are not failures, they are the map of the next territory. He got up, he turned off the lights, he locked the side door behind him and walked to his car in the parking lot of the Culver City production facility. The lot was empty except for a caretaker's truck and a dumpster, and the low evening light making long shadows of ordinary things. He drove home through the early valley evening traffic, past the strip malls and the gas stations and the apartment complexes with their small pools in back, past the schools and the churches and the fast food restaurants, through the ordinary fabric of a California life that had nothing in particular to do with the extraordinary afternoon he had just spent. He practiced the next morning. He always practiced the next morning. He brought to the practice a small, specific adjustment, a widening of one aspect of his defensive reading, an experiment with one reduction of preparation in a kicking combination, and the adjustment was invisible to anyone watching from outside. It was visible to him. It was visible in the way that the first footstep of a long road is visible, not because of what it covers, but because of where it points. He trained every day for the next 3 weeks, working the adjustment, depositing it in the body the way you deposit anything genuinely new, slowly at first until the form is clean, then with increasing speed as the clean form proves stable. By the 4th week, it was there, not perfected, not completed, but present, a real new thing in his body's intelligence that had not been there before. He did not tell anyone what had produced it. He had given his word. More than that, he understood, with the kind of understanding that only comes from actually being present for a thing, why the word needed to be kept. The afternoon in Culver City had the quality of things that need to remain in the place they happened. Not secrets exactly, not things hidden from shame, but things that belong to the specific people who were there and that lose their truth in the translation to a story told for people who weren't. He kept the word for the rest of his life. The film they made together the following year, Way of the Dragon, Rome, the Colosseum, the greatest fight sequence in martial arts cinema, contained, for those who could read it, the trace of that afternoon, not in anything specific enough to be pointed to and named, in the quality of the exchange, the way both men moved with the fluency of people who had worked this problem before and from whom the problem had therefore drawn something real. The way the loss, when it came, had the weight Bruce had specified. Not dishonoring, not diminishing, but revelatory. The way the fight was, despite its staged context, genuinely honest about the physics and the cost and the specific kind of respect that exists between two people who are trying as hard as they can. The Colosseum sequence, which ran 8 minutes in, its final cut, and had taken 2 days to film in the October cold of Rome in a location that Bruce had chosen for its symbolic weight, and that Chuck had been ambivalent about for exactly the reasons he had said in the soundstage, and that he had gone along with for the reason he had also said that the character's loss needed to mean something, and the setting provided meaning in ways that a more ordinary location would not, had been developed partly in Los Angeles and partly in Hong Kong during pre-production, in training sessions between the two men that were less formal and more exploratory than standard fight choreography. They were building something. They were building it from the things they actually knew, the things the floor actually held. And so what they built had the quality that genuine knowledge has when it is properly transmuted into form. It looked inevitable, as though it could not have been other than it was. Critics would write about the choreography. Martial artists would analyze the technique. Film scholars would write about the dramatic structure and the symbolic resonance of the Colosseum setting. All of this was true, and all of it missed the layer that was most real. The thing underneath the choreography, the quality that no camera instruction can produce, which is the quality of two people who have actually worked together at the actual boundary and who carry that working in their bodies and cannot help bringing it to the staged exchange because it has become part of them. The soundstage in Culver City was demolished in 1978, replaced by a smaller distribution warehouse that had no use for 40 feet by 60 feet of sprung hardwood floor. If any record existed of its specific layout, its dimensions, its smells, it existed only in the recollections of the production people who had worked there and who mostly remembered it as a tire shop that had been modified and that had poor ventilation and that had hosted one reasonably successful low-budget martial arts production before it was torn down to make room for something more economically rational. The afternoon of October 17, 1971, lived where it had always lived, in two bodies, in the adjustments those bodies carried forward into all subsequent training, in the films, and the teaching, and the students' students who inherited, without knowing they were inheriting it, the specific things the floor in Culver City had said to two people who were paying attention. Bruce Lee died on July the 20th, 1973. He was 32 years old. He died in Hong Kong from a cerebral edema, the brain swelling that the medical reports attributed to a reaction to a prescription painkiller, the cause that the years of speculation would eventually fail to improve upon. He had finished filming Enter the Dragon. He had not yet seen it released. Chuck Norris was in Los Angeles when he heard. The phone rang in the morning. It was actually Aaron Norris, his brother, who had heard through someone in the film community, who had called to tell him, choosing as people sometimes choose in these moments not to frame it as a question, but simply to say it. Chuck listened to the words. He sat down, and then he got up, and then he sat down again, which is the specific physics of grief when it arrives without warning, the body not knowing what posture is appropriate to the information it has just received. He was 33 years old. He had known Bruce for 3 years. In 3 years, a friendship between two serious people can go very deep, can accumulate the kind of history and mutual recognition that other friendships take decades to build, because the intensity and honesty of the exchange compress the time. In 3 years of working and arguing and eating together and sitting at the edges of parties, having conversations that had no interest in the parties around them, Chuck and Bruce had built something that was now, without warning, half gone. Not half gone, differently present. The living person was gone. What remained was the thing the living person had done. The films, the teachings, the students, the specific ideas about the martial arts that Bruce had put into the world, with the particular urgency of someone who always seemed to know at some level that time was not guaranteed. What remained was also what the friendship had deposited in Chuck Norris's body and mind and practice, the adjustments and the revisions and the frameworks that had been refined in conversation and on the floor, the specific things that Culver City Afternoon had produced. These did not diminish because their source had gone. They were already there, already part of the ongoing work. He cried. He is not someone who speaks about this in public, and so there is no record of it, but the mechanics of grief are not particular to the famous or the private. He would have been alone when he cried, or with his wife Diane, who would have known what to do and what not to do, which in these circumstances are closely related and not simple. He did not speak publicly about the friendship for a long time. When he did speak about it, years later in interviews, in his autobiography, he spoke about Bruce Lee with the specific quality of someone who is protecting something by naming it carefully. The generosity, the intelligence, the friendship, the genuine quality of the man, the loss. He spoke about the training they had done together. He did not speak about the specific afternoon in Culver City. He had given his word. He kept it even after the person he had given it to was gone. This is, in its way, the most accurate testament to what the afternoon had been. Not a story that needed telling, but a fact that had happened, that had produced its effects in the world through the two people who had been present for it, and that required no external confirmation to remain real. The floor had asked a question, and the floor had answered it, and the answer had been deposited in two bodies and lived there for as long as those bodies lived and beyond. In the work they had produced, and the students they had taught, and the specific quality of honesty that they had both, in their different ways, brought to everything they did with the art after that day. Outside the demolished soundstage, outside the trellis-replaced hardwood floor, outside the craft services table and the 3-day-old donuts and the 2 leaning false walls and the specific golden light of a California October afternoon, outside all of the specific irretrievable particulars of the day, the essential thing that had happened remained available, could be found again, was findable in any honest exchange between two people who are genuinely trying to know something rather than to prove it. Which is to say, the afternoon in Culver City is not gone. It changed form. It became part of the permanent record, not the record that is written down and cited and referenced, but the record that is carried in bodies, transmitted through practice, received by people who have prepared themselves to receive it without knowing where it came from or on what afternoon it was first given. Chuck Norris continued to train. He competed for 3 more years and added 3 more titles to his record. He made films. He taught. He built Chunkook Do into a codified system. He found faith, lost loved ones, continued. He carried the afternoon in the way that a river carries whatever it has moved through, not as a separate weight, but as part of the ongoing movement, inseparable from what he was and what he continued to become. He trained every morning. He always trained every morning. Outside his window, the valley settled into another evening. The smog had dispersed. The mountains were visible, which they weren't always. The light on them was the particular California light that makes everything look more permanent than it is and less permanent than it feels, which is perhaps the most accurate light available for illuminating a life. He breathed. He stood. He was still. Culver City, California, October 1971.